This is Webb Flowers. I'm the district conservationist for Iowa NRCS in Corydon, Iowa. And today we have a presentation that's being given by Henk Mooiweer. Henk is the CEO of Grassroots Carbon Public Benefits LLC, which is an organization that works with grazing, livestock, regenerative management producers to capture carbon credit marketing. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Henk and let him present. Thank you.
Absolutely, Charles. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you and the watchers of this YouTube. My name is Henk Mooiweer, the CEO and co-founder of Grassroots Carbon Public Benefit LLC. We try to make it easier for landowners to participate in the carbon markets. However, I'm not going to talk about grassroots carbon at all today. I'm more going to talk about the carbon market. What is a carbon credit? What is the carbon market? And as a landowner, a producer, a farmer, a rancher, what are some things you have to look out for when you actually want to participate? The carbon market is complex. There's a lot of players. There's a lot of questions you can ask, a lot of skepticism. And basically, you can forget about all those concerns. The carbon market is actually very simple. I don't need a lot of time to explain that. Just sell me your carbon, just trust me, and this is a very good deal. Any questions? Of course, that's not how it works. You will have a lot of questions and a lot of skepticism, and rightfully so. So what I'm going to talk about, first of all, how does a carbon market work and what might be important for landowners? So let's start with this first thing. How does a carbon market work? I want to go back all the way to why is there a carbon market in the first place? So it starts with the greenhouse gas effect. And what is the greenhouse gas effect? So energy from the sun is beamed to the earth and it warms the earth. Some of the energy is actually escaping back into space, but some of the energy is trapped into our atmosphere and actually held by greenhouse gases. If there was no atmosphere on the planet, scientists have calculated that the Earth atmosphere would be about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So very difficult for plants to and human beings to exist. So an atmosphere with greenhouse gases is good. If you look at the additional greenhouse gases, because one of the major greenhouse gases is also water vapor, but the additional greenhouse gas emissions is for large amount CO2, then there's methane, there's nitrogen oxides, and there's fluorinated compounds. So that's basically what we talk about. When people talk about greenhouse gases, they quite often talk about carbon dioxide and methane. That's the key things they have in mind there. And if you then look where are they coming from, is that you see that a lot of these greenhouse gases come from transportation, from the production of electricity, from industry, commercial residential use, and also from agriculture. A lot of them, at the end of the day, come from the burning of hydrocarbon fuels. Coal, oil, gas, natural gas. If you burn them, you create CO2. And if you are producing natural gas and you have some leakage at the wells and at the valves, you get methane emissions, but also from agriculture, you get methane and nitrogen oxide. So that's the sources. Companies are under strong pressure to reduce their carbon emissions or CO2 emissions. Carbon emissions or CO2 emissions are basically used as the same term. Companies have a carbon footprint. What is a carbon footprint? A carbon footprint is basically the total amount of greenhouse gases, emissions caused by an individual, an event, an organization, or a place or a product, and it's expressed as carbon dioxide equivalents. So basically everything is expressed in CO2, even if it's methane. Methane has a different greenhouse gas impact, a different impact on how it can keep the sun radiation on our planet, but everything is expressed in CO2. So keep that in mind. So this pressure on companies to reduce the greenhouse gases comes from everywhere. It comes from customers, it comes from governments, it comes from environmental groups, it comes from financial institutions. So a strong pressure, and the pressure is rapidly increasing. So companies have a problem. However, the good news is you have a solution, and you offer a solution which is basically right under our feet. That's the cool news there. So if someone has a problem and you have a solution, you can actually take advantage of that in a good way. So this all goes back to photosynthesis and nature's miracle technology that basically drives your business and any farming and ranching business. So photosynthesis, you know, this is still from your school textbook. Atmospheric carbon, CO2, plus water react in the green parts of the plant with sunlight and form sugars and oxygen. These sugars are being used to grow the plant, so that's the plant biomass, and it's actually also soil carbon. So the sugars are being used to grow the plant. They're pumped also into the root systems and then handed out from the roots into the soil to microorganisms. And the microorganisms give nutrients back to the plant to return. So at the end of the day, it is atmospheric CO2 pumped into the plant, into the root systems, into the soil. That's what we're talking about. Cool. So basically, if you look at this, you have a system that captures atmospheric CO2 using natural photosynthesis and pump it into the soil as soil carbon. That's what you have. So if you have healthy soil, your property will store atmospheric CO2 in your soil. Cool. Companies emit CO2. We just talked about it. They have a carbon footprint. So imagine if a company is emitting a ton of CO2, 2,200 pounds of CO2, and you store a ton of CO2 in your soil, the overall impact on the atmospheric CO2 is zero, because you basically stored that ton of CO2 in your soil. That's interesting. Companies are willing to pay you for your CO2 storage service if you can actually demonstrate that and maybe measure it and put it back to them in the form of carbon credits. So if you store CO2 in your soil and it can be turned into a carbon credit, basically a certificate giving the guarantee to a carbon credit buyer that you stored a ton of CO2, they're willing to pay you money for that. For instance, $20 per ton of CO2 as an example. So that's how a carbon credit system actually works. So you store CO2, if it can be turned into a certificate, a credit, people are willing to pay you for that. Cool. So basically, the carbon storage market is connecting supply and demand. The demand is for carbon footprint reduction. So can you reduce a carbon footprint? The supply is your carbon footprint reduction service. That is what you with your farm or ranch is actually supplying. So if you deliver credits, companies are willing to pay you for those credits because you store their CO2. Yeah, that's how it works. So let's look a little bit in more detail at the markets here, because there are different type of markets. At this point in time, we're in a voluntary market in the United States. So what does it mean? It's voluntary. It's not forced by law. It's basically typical standard commercial terms and conditions. Those, of course, follow the law, but nobody in government is telling you to store CO2. So buyer and seller agree on price and terms. So if you plant a tree and you offer a carbon reduction service and you turn it into carbon credits and the buyer accepts that, they can pay you for that service there. There's also regulatory markets, not in the United States yet, maybe the exception of California, but it's happening. So two different markets there. It can be a carbon tax. So if you have a carbon tax market, it means that the emitter, a company, has to pay carbon tax for emitted carbon dioxide, CO2. However, if you buy carbon credits, you can submit them from your emissions, so you don't have to pay tax. So in this example, if you emit 1,000 tons of CO2, but you also buy 1,000 tons of CO2 credits, you don't have to pay tax. Okay, that can be interesting. The other one is the cap and trade situation. So an emitter is only allowed to emit a certain amount of CO2. So for instance, 500 tons of CO2. If you emit more, you have to buy credits for that, or you can sell what you don't emit to someone else. So in this example, if you emit 1,000 tons, but the cap and trade is 500, you have to buy 500 tons of credits. We're not in that situation in the United States. There's no regulatory market. That market exists in Europe, for instance. But over time, there's a lot of expectation that the United States will move into that situation. But of course, nobody knows exactly how long it will take. So in the US, we're in a voluntary market. As long as a buyer and a seller agree, they can have a carbon business. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Because a market can only work if there's sufficient demand and sufficient supply. So let's look at the demand side first. Is there actually demand, and how much is there? Okay, this again, to fresh up your mind. This came from companies are under tremendous pressure to reduce their carbon or CO2 emissions. It comes from customers who expect that and maybe buy products which are CO2 neutral. It comes from governments, it comes from investors, and it comes from NGOs, environmental organizations. Pressures to do something about the carbon footprint. So if you look at this kind of staircase, from the bottom is business as usual, to the next step is lower carbon emissions, to carbon neutral operations, carbon neutral products, carbon negative products. That means that you actually store more carbon than your product and your manufacturing process is emitting. And you can all the way on the top is regenerative. You see in the last several years that companies really are taking steps on the staircase. Few companies are in business as usual. Almost all of them in lower carbon emissions or carbon neutral operations. A lot of them are to carbon neutral products, and even large energy companies made strong commitments that all their products, even gasoline and aviation fuel, will be carbon neutral. Some companies like Stripe and Microsoft will be carbon negative, but the top of the whole thing is regenerative, where you also close material cycles, not just carbon. The beauty from nature-based solutions, and storing carbon in your soil, is actually that it works for every step of the staircase, in contrast to some technologies. Okay, keep in mind that if you're a company, you have a lot of different options to reduce your carbon footprint. So that's good to know. You have competition. So when you're a landowner and you store soil carbon, you have competition from other solutions there. A company can first go for lower carbon emissions. They can go for emission reduction. And that actually means that they can go for lighter fuels. They can go for lighter fuels with less carbon in there. They can go for solar, they can go for wind. That's the first solution they should go. It's quite often the most affordable pathway. Then they can buy offsets. Offsets are sometimes a little bit strange. Offsets are also carbon credits, but if I build a wind turbine and I save carbon emissions, you can pay me for the carbon emissions I have saved. Or if I have a forest, you can pay me actually for carbon credits to not chop down the trees of my forest or to not till my land. It's a little bit weird. I sometimes call it a carbon hostage situation. It's actually not saving atmospheric carbon, but it's avoiding that you get more emissions. Then you have carbon storage solutions that can be technology-based. So the energy industry is very keen on technology because that's the language they speak. There's a lot of news about carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, where they store CO2 in old reservoirs or new reservoirs using big compressors, very expensive. And then a lot of news, especially over the holidays, from these CO2 sucking machines, direct air capture, very large machines, very expensive to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and turn it into solids. It's questionable how scalable these technologies at the end of the day are. And then you have, as the last opportunity, nature-based solutions, very well known as, for instance, forestry. If you plant a tree, you start storing carbon. Way less known at that point in time is soil carbon. So that's what we're talking about in this presentation here. So keep in mind, when you talk about soil carbon on your property, you're competing with a lot of other solutions there. So it's not just that you have the only solution, you have a solution as part of a larger portfolio. Keep that in mind. Okay, back to how companies think, and especially energy companies. They think in steel and engineers and reservoirs. So it's a very obvious way how they look basically at solutions. And if you start talking them about nature-based solutions, soil carbon, they understand it, they see it, but they're also very hesitant to actually embark in that area. they see it as fragile. Is it robust enough? How can you trust it? So it's easy for them to wait a little bit and keep actually investing in steel. So what happens if you look at the United States with an emission of 6.6 billion tons of CO2 per year? By the way, the whole planet is about 50 billion tons per year. You see that a lot of emphasis is going to CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, a lot in the news. And if you look at the numbers there, which are being quoted, $100 billion per year, 24 targets, that's still away from here, is about 1.5 billion tons of CO2 per year. There's a lot of emphasis on direct air capture. United Airlines on the airports has big posters about doing that. And of course, there's a lot of money going to forestry. There's not so much money going to soil CCS at this point in time, or capturing, storing carbon in grassland soil or in row cropping soil. So it would be fantastic if a huge chunk of that money, which flowing to the left here, would actually go to regenerative solutions, which store carbon in soil, but are so much more. It's not just about storing carbon, it's also about restoring ecology, grassland ecology or growing crop ecology, with all the impacts on soil, water, on birds, insect, wildlife, plant diversity, etc., etc. So this is what this is about. So keep in mind, a lot of money will go to carbon solutions. What we try to do is, of course, ensure that nature-based regenerative solutions will get a huge chunk of that pie there. Some companies start to understand this. This is an example of the CEO from Shell, Ben van Beurden, who basically said that Shell will use nature to store 120 million tons of CO2 per year in 2030, that's only 8 years from now, in forests, wetlands, and soil, in high quality, independently verified projects. So keep in mind how large these volumes actually are, 120 million tons of CO2 per year. If you start thinking about CO2 prices of $20 per ton or more, you're talking about a lot of money, which can go to agriculture and grazing and row cropping. Okay, so there is demand. There's a tremendous need for carbon storage. How about the supply? How about the supply side? What is the situation there? It's good to actually look at our planet and see where carbon is being stored. There's an awful lot of carbon in the oceans, and this is a number in gigatons. Then there's a lot of carbon in plants. That means all biomass on the planet. It's forest, it's the Amazon, it's all the grasslands, 450 to 600 gigatons. Then there's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, 823. And these are numbers from 2014. In the meantime, that number is higher because that's the issue. That number is increasing all the time. But what few people realize is that there is more carbon in the first 3 feet of soil than all plant biomass combined and all atmospheric carbon combined. So nature naturally stores carbon in the first 3 feet of soil. It's a very natural place to be for carbon. So how do you store carbon in soil? It starts with healthy vegetation, because vegetation, using photosynthesis and water and sunlight and CO2, actually stores, turns CO2 into sugars. Then you need healthy soils, and healthy soils are dependent on abundant soil microbes, and they lead to soil carbon. So how you manage your plants is basically critical for how you manage how much carbon you will store. So microbes depend on plants, and how you can manage plants is basically using animals to manage those plants as well. So grazing is part of that whole system. We focus tremendously at grazing grasslands, not so much as row cropping, but the principles are similar. Grazing example here, if you move from conventional grazing on the left side of this picture to regenerative grazing on the right side of this picture, conventional grazing, cattle is free roaming, no resting period, and the cattle bites the same plant over and over. It leads to quite often to soil carbon loss, or certainly not an increase. You move to the right side, adaptive grazing, regenerative grazing, multi-paddock grazing, holistic land management, where you basically graze for a very short, intense period, but sometimes that's a half a day or a day. It depends on your land, depends on how much rainfall you had. And then your grassland gets a long resting period, everything is changing. Your root systems become very deep. You start absorbing water in soil, soil microbes come back, birds, insects, wildlife, everything is going to change on that property. And on top of that, because you grow more forage, you can also have more animals on your property. That leads to carbon storage. Depending on where you are, it can be 1 to over 4 tons of CO2 per acre per year. A lot of carbon storage. So that's important. So there is sufficient supply. 40% of the United States is basically used for livestock management. 40% of our service area, that's tremendous. Not saying that all these properties are suitable at this point in time for abundant carbon storage, but in principle, they can all store much more carbon than they do right now. So how about the price? Because we have supply, we have demand. What about the price? Is that attractive, yes or no? Well, let's look at the European market, because they're ahead of us, at least in how they deal with carbon. In May, the price, May 21 last year, the price was $60 per ton of CO2. I checked this yesterday. The price increased already to $93 per ton of CO2 in Europe. Of course, we're not in Europe, and I don't have a crystal ball. But what you can say probably quite confidently is that the CO2 price will go up in the coming years. And prices in the United States over $40 per ton of CO2 in 2030 are actually just very likely. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but this is probably very, very likely. So a lot of money involved. You can also look at European data, what you see over here in the table on the right side, and compare with Californian data and Australian data. You see actually quite some high numbers there. Those are all compliance markets. If you look at the voluntary market, nature-based carbon offset, $15, much lower. Keep in mind that also contains a lot of forestry credits. Basically, those type of credits where you actually pay someone to not chop down a tree. So that can be a much lower price, a different quality of the credits as well. So this changes all over time, but again, expectation that this price will go up. All right, next slide. So keep in mind that this price is based on supply demand. A company has a lot of opportunities. They can do this whole portfolio of solutions. So at the end of the day, what the price will be depends on the supply demand situation. That's what it's determining. Okay, so we have supply, we have demand, we have a price. We're actually good to go. Why not start this whole business? And that's basically what's maybe happening. Let's go, a carbon Wild West. You might almost say we're moving from removing carbon, which we did in the beginning of the 1900s, to a situation where we are all racing to store carbon back in the soil. And it's really compared sometimes to Wild West. People talk about dodgy methodologies. It's a free-for-all. And it's very hard. So what you actually see on landowner side is a lot of skepticism and concerns, and rightfully so. Questions landowners should ask is, do I get a fair deal? Who is getting the profit here? When will they actually pay me? Will they pay me at all? Will they take over my ranch? So, maybe it's much better to wait a little bit. And we see that response quite often from landowners. But you see the same thing on the carbon buyer side. How can I be sure that carbon is actually stored? Because I pay a lot of money for it. Why is it so expensive? Why would I trust soil carbon? How long will they store carbon? So maybe it's better to wait. So the skepticism and concerns also lead to a situation that both parties wait and are very hesitant to move forward. So if you look at a survey which was done, I think last year, recent farmers will not participate in carbon markets. It's basically, 64% says I need more information I can trust. 15% said the payment is just not worth it. 9% the carbon markets are not developed enough. 7% said not enough benefit for farmers. 5% I don't want to share my data. So very rightfully concerns and skepticism. While we're skeptical on both the carbon credit buyer side, but also on the landowner side, in the meantime, the money will flow to technology solutions and forestry. So keep that in mind. Skepticism might come at an enormous missed opportunity for landowners. So I understand the skepticism, but also keep in mind that companies actually are actively investing in carbon solutions right now. Cool. So there are many standards. Standards basically determine how you turn carbon data into carbon credits. So there are a lot of standards. There's a Verra and a CAR and an ACR and a B carbon. USDA is working on the Growing Climate Solutions Act. So there are a lot of standards. So what standard is best for you? On top of that, there are many brokers. So which broker is best for you? There's many brokers out there. And I think on a monthly basis, this will increase. So how do you select the right broker there? So that's not easy. Basically, what is a broker and a standard? You can see that in the scheme. If you have a rancher or a farmer storing carbon in soil, you have a soil carbon storage buyer on the other side. It's basically turning the soil carbon storage data into soil carbon storage credits. And quite often there are many parties involved. There's an assembler, like Grassroots Carbon, or any other assembler. There can be a measurement company who measures something. That can be soil samples, it can be remote sensing. And then there should be independent verification and then certification. And that's where the standard comes in place. So that's basically how a scheme generally works. So which assembler you select or which standard you select really should fit your needs. And you have to do some homework. There's no way without doing homework. I want to move to basically the second part of this presentation. Now you know a little bit how carbon credits are being generated and how a carbon credit market might work and what the value might be. What is important for you to consider? So a couple of things you should ask before you sign anything, and you have to do your homework here. It has to do with freedom. So what practices and changes are expected during the contract you have? Do you have to do something different? What are my commitments after the contract ends and of how long? Who will develop a carbon plan for the farm or ranch? So most brokers and standards require Kyoto principles type of based additionality. So that means that you have to do something different. It cannot pay too much, etc., etc. So you have to do something different than you normally do. Some brokers don't require it, but a lot of them do. So be very clear and try to understand what is it you have to change? What is it you have to start doing? And does that fit actually with how you want to manage your farm or ranch? Then the second thing is that farmers and ranchers often must have an elaborate plan showing what you'll be doing, and that what you're doing is different. And you might have evidence that you follow that plan. So it might require a lot of bookkeeping, a lot of administration. Is that something you would like to do here? And then the other thing is the commitments. Some contracts require you to sign for 20 years, 40 years, or even 100 years to guarantee the buyer some permanence. Is 20, 40, 100 years something you can sign up with your family? Some brokers have much shorter terms. So ask these questions. It's important to understand them. Price. So important. So are there any upfront or continuing cost to pay or participate? Do you have to invest before you can participate? Ask how much and when will you be paid? That's really important. How will an increasing carbon price be incorporated? I showed in the previous part of my presentation that we can all expect that the carbon price will go up. Will you benefit from that? Because it's you store the carbon, so can you benefit from that? And then really important, what cut does the project broker or assembler take? So a couple of remarks there. Beware of a fixed price per acre, because if you store more carbon, will you be paid for that? Be very aware of a fixed price for many years, because the carbon price might go up rapidly. And ensure you get a fair share. You actually store the carbon. You're the one storing the carbon, so you get the fair share. Next one, robustness. How long, what is the length of the contract? How is soil carbon being determined? Is it just estimated? Is it measured? How is it being done? How is soil carbon certified? Are carbon buyers actually under contract? And what is the broker's experience? So some brokers only use models or satellite images. Will this lead to correct assessment of your soil carbon? Do they underestimate what you store? Or is it valued by the buyers for the quality? Some brokers take samples only 30 centimeters deep. Well, you know, from prairie grass systems, the root systems are much, much deeper. So this is actually enough. Do they miss out on a lot of carbon? How is a baseline determined when you start? Is it measured? Is it actually estimated? How are they doing that? And when can you expect payment? So some brokers aim to get millions of acres under contract, but they have not secured the buyers yet. So that is some kind of promise you might get in the future. So be very careful to ask those questions. And then the last one, the risks. So you need to understand the risk of participating in this. Who owns the data and how will these data be used? What are your risks? And how can you enter the agreement? Ensure you have a good overview of all your risk. Ensure that you have an option to get out of a contract to switch to a better deal, maybe at a penalty, but you should not be locked in too much. This is a market in development. So just be careful that you're not locked in too long. Those are a couple of those things you have to check. I summarized them here. Beware of your freedom. Ensure that you understand the payments. What is the robustness of the contract and the credits, and understand your risks. This is important. You have to do your homework there to understand this opportunity. Just saying, I'm skeptical, I'm concerned, I want to wait, you miss out potential on a lot of opportunities. The opportunities are right there. And keep in mind that companies are investing enormous amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars per year, up to billions of dollars per year in carbon solutions. So you should benefit from it. But this is at this point in time where I want to stop my presentation, and I'm opening to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Henk. We certainly appreciate the depth and the knowledge that you've shared with us on carbon credit marketing. You've done an excellent job. I guess one question that I have is, would you care to share with us your thoughts on a timeline for ranchers, farmers, forestry, landowners to know how to capture data and adequately be able to sell carbon credits?
Yeah, that's a very broad question, Charles. So at this point in time, there's several brokers who actually are offering carbon benefits to landowners. I can talk for Grassroots Carbon very rapidly. We're actively working with landowners. We're actually paying landowners. So this week, a bunch of checks are being written and mailed for significant sums of money for the carbon we measured a year ago. And that will be done on an annual basis. So we're rapidly expanding. We experience a tremendous interest from companies and organizations. We're seeing a rapid growth in companies who really care about ecological, nature-based carbon storage, because they see a lot of ecological benefits far beyond just carbon. I think you see the same trends in forestry, you see the same trends in row cropping. So this market is developing. There's a lot of players. You have to do your homework, but you can step in right now. The opportunities are right there.
Thank you very much, Henk. At this point, we'll conclude our presentation, and I would like to point out to you that Henk Mooiweer's contact information will be available on the YouTube site where these recordings will be placed for public viewing. So if you have additional questions, don't hesitate to contact Henk Mooiweer at Grassroots Carbon Public Benefit LLC. Thank you so much, Henk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Charles. Indeed, you have to do your homework. There's no way around it, but we're super happy to answer any questions you might have. Please do contact us. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you.